welcome to another edition of Green is Good. This is the ISRI edition of Green is Good in beautiful downtown Vancouver, British Columbia. We're at the Vancouver Convention Center, and we're so excited to have back with us on Green is Good Joe Pickard. He's the Director of Commodities of ISRI. Welcome back to Green is Good, Joe.
Thanks for having me, John. Pleasure to be here.
You know, Joe, I loved it when you first came on Green is Good. I learned a lot about commodities. We're going to be talking about commodities today, and almost everyone's talking about commodities now. It's become one of the hottest topics in the entire world. You turn on Bloomberg or CNBC or the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, commodities is like the hottest topic.
For better or worse, yes.
That's great. So before we get to talking about the story of commodities in ISRI and the whole recycling industry as a whole with regards to commodities, for our audience that hasn't met you before or heard you speak before, can you share a little bit about your background leading up to joining ISRI and your love and understanding of commodities and what you do?
Sure. So I'm an economist by training. So I'm ISRI's chief economist and director of commodities. Prior to serving at ISRI, I was the economist at the International Copper Study Group in Lisbon, Portugal. So the Copper Study Group looks not only at supply and demand dynamics for copper, but also copper recycling rates, copper scrap usage, and that was one of the first exposures for me to sort of scrap and recycling statistics professionally. But I've had a long-standing interest in recycling and economics going back to graduate school, so the opportunity to work at ISRI to combine the interest in economics, in commodities, and recycling was a perfect fit for me.
What year did you join ISRI?
I joined ISRI in 2010.
2010. So has commodities always been at the forefront of the recycling industry, or when things are good, people aren't as concerned, but when things take a dip like what we seem to be in right now, it becomes a much hotter topic and the predictability becomes even more difficult?
Well, it's always a commodities business, right? So our members have to go through the commodity cycle that other industries have to go through as well. And our industry has certainly seen the ups and downs, not just in the current cycle, but over the last decades, we've gone through a number of these cycles. And it's the smart companies that are forward-looking that really are great at weathering these kind of storms. But I think with the slowdown in China today, the decreased commodity prices that we're seeing basically across the spectrum, we're seeing an increased attention to commodities, as you've seen, and that's had a disproportionate effect on the scrap industry because recycling, it's a commodities-based business.
Let's talk about it as an industry. How big is the recycling industry with regards to commodities? How big is the commodities industry as a whole?
Yep. So our industry annually recycles between 130 and 140 million metric tons per year across all commodities. The biggest by volume tends to be ferrous, iron and steel scrap, where we're recycling over 70 million metric tons per year. On recovered paper and fiber, we're doing 40 to 50 million tons per year, and then we're doing a lot on electronics, on related metals like non-ferrous and precious metals as well, but all told in the neighborhood of 135 million tons annually.
As a term of art, commodity means what? What is a commodity as a term of art, and what is not a commodity?
Commodity is anything that can be traded interchangeably, right? So a ton of copper that you get out of the mine in Chile is going to be the same as a ton of copper, in theory, that a consumer in China would use. So if you can exchange money for a similar good that's interchangeable, basically you're looking at a commodity.
Joe, last August, oil was somewhere trading in the $101, $102 area, and I think this morning when we woke up, it had literally spiked a little bit up to $57. How does the price of oil and this whole new trend of fracking, maybe the Iran deal taking effect after June 1st, how do all these international economic trends, some are headlines, some are trend lines for the future, how are they affecting the price of oil and therefore then affecting the price of all the commodities as a whole?
Right, and it's a valid point because the price of oil is highly correlated to other commodities, especially within the scrap industry.
Yeah.
And the impact of these changing energy prices is sort of multifaceted on the recycling industry. So on the one hand, the recycling industry is a consumer of energy, right? So it takes energy to process scrap and recycled commodities.
Right.
So when those input prices come down, that's a positive in terms of making it more inexpensive to process those materials. On the other hand, we're seeing the reasons for the drop-off. We've seen a little bit of a resurgence in the oil price, but the drop-off, like you noted, since the second half of last year, because we're seeing really a glut of crude oil production and demand not really keeping up with that. And so we're seeing that as a recurring story, not just in crude oil, but also in iron ore, where a lot of these major producers are continuing to pump out larger and larger quantities of the materials, even though prices are slumping, in an effect to capture market share. And that has a depressing effect across the commodities, which we see not just in oil and iron, but also in steel and non-ferrous metals and other commodities as well.
I just saw a BBC special on that 2 nights ago that said, just like the Saudis, taking a page from the Saudis' oil playbook, Rio Tinto's doing exactly what you said, and it's having the same effect as you just pointed out.
That's right. It's the major miners, not just Rio Tinto, but BHP Billiton too.
Right.
In the first quarter, they produced about 59 million tons of iron ore, which is a 20% increase year on year, even though prices are slumping. So you're seeing the major miners in Australia, but also Brazil, increasing their iron ore mine output. And now China's announced that it's going to create some incentives to increase iron ore production within China too, which is going to further exacerbate an already supply glut.
Do you believe in the thesis that's come out recently in the last week or so that iron ore prices will continue at the low rate that there are today through 18? Is that right now the state of the art, or?
I don't do price forecasting per se, but I think if you continue to see these miners pump out excess production, and you see slowly improving demand, but not enough to catch up with that capacity, you're going to have continued downward pressure on pricing.
Let's go back to oil for a second and energy. What's going on now? Is it a major chess match between Russia, the Saudis, the frackers in America, and who's coming out ahead, and where is this whole fascinating reshifting of the paradigms going to leave us in 6 months or a year? What do you foresee?
Well, I think on the demand side, on the oil, it's not that bad of a picture. The economy globally is actually growing. So that's a relatively positive indicator. The problem is there is this sort of race to capture market share. And so the OPEC countries in particular have been very clear in their intention that they're going to continue to increase output in an effort to sort of knock out some of the higher cost producers, including some of the producers here in North America. And I think we've seen that have an impact on the amount of drilling that we're going to see here in the U.S.
Isn't it true that the North America now is producing more oil than the Saudis?
It is, but if the Saudis and other OPEC countries continue to provide excess supplies, that's going to make it more difficult for us to increase our production, especially higher up on the production cost curve.
Being an economist, and you look at both forward trends and backward history, to try to give better understanding to laymen like myself and our audience members, what is it true or not true that our storage right now of our energy reserves is somewhere at an 80-year high or something like that?
Yep. So inventories are very closely watched, and I think some of the increase in the inventory levels has been part of the reason why we saw the sell-off in crude oil prices from the second half of 2014 into early 2015. Like you noted, we've seen a little bit of a resurgence, but I think part of that is due to the expectation that OPEC's efforts to squeeze out some of these higher cost producers might actually begin to start bearing fruit. And if that happens, you might see a little bit more of a rebalancing between supply and demand.
Oil at 100 in a couple of years?
I hope so.
Yeah, okay. Fair enough. Switching to another topic with regards to commodities, Joe. If you and I were sitting here 5 or 6 years ago, the talk of the town back then was all about BRIC, and you and I would be talking about the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China. Right. Is BRICS alive, or is the BRIC consortium and the importance of BRIC starting to fade, and the world opening up even to bigger and better possibilities when it comes to trading commodities?
I think on the commodities spectrum, and especially with scrap, we're seeing it open up. Historically, we've been very dependent on China as an overseas market because we've seen such rapid Chinese growth and voracious appetite for commodities.
Right.
So scrap exporters from the U.S. became very dependent on China. For some of the commodities like copper and aluminum, we're exporting upwards of 70% of those commodities just to China, just to mainland China, not even including Hong Kong.
Wow.
So I think as Chinese economic growth has started to wane, we really need to find other markets internationally. And I think there are some real opportunities overseas outside of China.
Is India going to start taking on the role that China had, or is that in the near future, or is that a more distant future?
Well, I think the growth that we saw in China was kind of a once-in-a-generation kind of growth story. I think it's ongoing. It's just moderating the rate of growth. I think India has tremendous potential as well. I don't know that we're going to see the same kind of explosive growth in India for a number of reasons that we're seeing in China. But today, at least, Indian economic growth is probably as good or better than in China.
China, are we just taking a pause and it will come back again, or is this leveling off here to stay for the foreseeable future?
I'd say we're going to see more moderate growth in China than what we saw in the last decade for the next, probably short term at the very least.
GDP a minimum of 6.5%?
I'd say this year the expectation is 7%. GDP is always a little bit of a tricky story in China because it seems like Chinese growth tends to meet the exact target that Beijing sets frequently.
Just happens.
It's which is great.
Right.
But I think over the next couple of years, the expectations are below 7% growth, probably 2015, 16, 17.
No kidding. For our audience out there just joined us, we've got back on Green is Good Joe Pickard. He's the Director of Commodities for ISRI. To learn more about what Joe does and his colleagues do at ISRI, please go to www.isri.org. This is the ISRI edition of Green is Good, coming from the Vancouver Convention Center in downtown Vancouver, British Columbia. Joe, ISRI just commissioned a report on the economic impact of the recycling industry. Can you give our audience a little preview of what's in this report, and how can they get access to this important report?
Sure. So the report will be available on our website. We're in the process of updating it now, so give us till the beginning of next week, maybe.
Okay.
So that'll be April 27th, 28th should be available.
Great.
Just a sneak preview of the sort of big numbers that came out of the report. Total economic impact of the recycling industry in the United States, $105 billion this year is the expectation.
Annualized.
Correct.
Wow.
Yep. The industry directly employs about 150,000 people, but if you include the jobs that are supported by our industry, whether it's our equipment suppliers or others who are supported by scrap recycling, that number expands to about 470,000 jobs.
Wow.
Yeah.
How does our industry, the recycling industry, compare to other industries in the United States?
It's comparable size to a lot of major manufacturing sectors. It's bigger than, I think, all professional sports leagues combined.
Wow.
It makes a huge impact on our economy, for sure.
Right. And you said 150,000 jobs. What kind of jobs are these typically?
Typically extremely well-paying jobs. We see the scrap recycling industry as sort of the first stage in the manufacturing sector. We're really the backbone of manufacturing because we supply such, high quality but necessary raw material goods to manufacturing. So these are really manufacturing jobs that are, make a positive contribution not just to the local economies and to state coffers, but to the nation as a whole.
Talk a little bit more about the local economies. What kind of impact does the recycling industry have? Is it more national? Is it more local with regards to cities and states and local municipalities?
Well, we've got scrap recycling facilities in every state in the country, and we've got ISRI members alone have over 3,000 facilities, processing facilities from coast to coast. And so we're basically everywhere, making huge impacts in local communities as well.
Speak to the issue of recycling as, again, an international opportunity and how it helps balance our trade issues here in the United States.
Sure. So in the U.S., we're blessed with having a really large supply of scrap on hand. So we have enough scrap not only to meet the needs of our domestic industry, but we can also export to countries around the world. So exports have become an increasingly important share of our industry's revenues. If you look back at the year 2000, exports were about 18% of our industry's revenues. By 2010, that number had increased to about 38%. So while most of the scrap that gets processed in the U.S. is still consumed here, the export has been an increasingly important share. And today, we're exporting all around the world, and exports are typically in the neighborhood of about 40 million metric tons. Last year, were valued at over $20 billion.
Wow.
That's just the export piece alone.
Let's go back to the topic of commodities, Joe. We talked about oil a little bit. We talked a little bit about steel. Talk a little bit about the precious metals, gold, silver, and then also a little bit on copper.
Sure.
Again, not asking you to take out a perfect crystal ball, but where do you start seeing the trends there? Do things look as dour for gold and silver as they do a little bit for steel, or where do you see those precious metals going?
Well, precious metals and gold in particular are a little bit different from the ferrous and the non-ferrous, in that they're a reflection not just of supply and demand, but of global risk factors, right? So when risk aversion tends to go up, so does the price of gold, because people want safe haven assets to flock to, like treasury bonds and gold as well. And so we've seen a little bit of a weakness in precious metal prices over the last year. I think gold is probably trading around $1,200 a troy ounce today, which is still a pretty healthy level historically speaking. But gold is such a high per unit value item that the recycling of gold and the precious metals really adds a lot to the recycling industry revenues on a dollar basis. Not necessarily on a volume basis, but on a dollar basis, the precious metals are extremely important. And I think the outlook, given the number of risk factors in the world today, whether it's slower Chinese growth, whether it's concerns about the European Union, whether it's concerns about what's going on in the Middle East, those risk factors all tend to be supportive of safe haven assets like gold. So that's a positive, I think, for gold going forward. If you look at some of the non-ferrous metals, you mentioned copper. That's, I think the expectation is that China is such an important part of copper consumption. It's about 40% of global copper usage is just China. The slowdown in Chinese growth has a disproportionate effect on copper prices, which is why you've seen copper trading at or below $6,000 a ton recently, versus its heights, at the height of the commodity boom, above $10,000 a ton.
Besides China, is copper also tied to the price of energy?
There is a relationship, certainly historically, between oil prices and copper. A lot of the non-ferrous metals, copper in particular, but aluminum probably even more so, are energy intensive in terms of getting copper out of the ground, getting aluminum out of the ground and processed, bauxite I should say. And so there is a close correlation between oil and some of these non-ferrous metals. This report that is coming out in the next couple of days and getting published within a week or so, how often does ISRI publish this report? So this has been conducted for us by an independent consulting firm in New York called John Dunham & Associates. Okay. This is the third version of this report that they've done. So they had done previous versions in 2013 and 2011. So every 2 years? Every 2 years, yep. Every 2 years. Gotcha. So, we're coming to the end of the show, Joe. What's your feeling on the future of the recycling industry? Are we just in a little lull period now and it's going to come storming back in the future? Do you feel bullish? Where are we today? All right, so I'd say short term, we've certainly had some problems like we've talked about on the commodities front with prices coming down. Right. But this is an extremely resilient industry. I think the long-term prospects for the scrap recycling industry are extremely bullish and extremely positive. For one thing, you've got this confluence of concerns about sustainable development, about the need for commodities, and about continuing urbanization in a lot of these developing countries, which have a lot of room to grow, not just China, but also Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Latin America. I think when you combine all those elements, recycling is going to be even more important going future, and it's even brighter prospects for the scrap recyclers. That's so great. And that's a great message of hope that we'll end today's show on. Joe, we thank you for all the great work you do at ISRI. It's my pleasure. And for coming on the show on a regular basis and sharing with our audience your thoughts. Very important thoughts. This issue of commodities is so important for this total industry, for our economy, for these 150,000 jobs. And we're just very appreciative. You're a sustainability superstar and obviously truly living proof that green is good. This has been John Shigarian and Joe Pickard from the ISRI Green is Good Special Edition here in Vancouver, British Columbia at the Vancouver Convention Center. Thank you for joining us. To learn more about ISRI, please go to www.isri.org and see us at GreenIsGood Radio.fm. See you on our next episode. Thank you again.